Hey quilters, Sarah from Snuggle Bug Stitching here. So today we are going to look at some pinwheels and reducing the bulk at the seam in the pinwheels. So when you look at pinwheels, got some here. They are, by nature of the pinwheel, there's going to be a lot of bulk right here in the center because you've got 8 pieces of fabric coming together in one point. So just by nature of the pinwheels, there's going to be a lot of bulk there. So here's some pinwheels sewn together, and the seams for the half square triangles are all pressed towards the dark side of the fabric, but the problem is that cross-section seam as far as all the bulk, and that's what you have to work on to reduce it. So there's a couple ways you can do that. One way that you can reduce the bulk on the seams is to press that seam open, and if you chain pieced your pinwheels, you'll have, there we can see it, you'll have this little part right here where that's still connected. So go ahead and break that little connection and then press that open. And that's going to reduce some of the bulk at the seams there. And if you press that open, you can use a clapper, a tailor's clapper, or I actually have an old maple cutting board that I use in place of a clapper. So I've got one of the seams, one of these pressed here. So you can see I pressed that open. And you can see it lays nice and flat. Now once you press the back seam, you can always flip that over and give it a press from the top and use your clapper on that to flatten out those seams. And after this explanation, I'll play a clip from the video where I was showing using my maple cutting board as a tailor's clapper, just so that you can see the rhythm I got into and how I used that. So that's one way that you can reduce the bulk at the seams with your pinwheels. And another thing you can do is to spin your seams. So when you spin your seams, you'll flip it over, and like I said, if you chain piece these, you'll have a place where it is still connected, and you will want to use your seam ripper to break that connection. So once you get that little connection broke, what you're going to do when you spin your seams is you are going to basically unpick the stitches, the first couple of stitches in this seams. And if it doesn't unpick easily, use your seam ripper to do it, just because you don't want to tear your fabric. But you see mine's coming apart pretty easy there. And unpick those stitches, and then once you have those unpicked, I like to press this side of that seam to the dark side and this side of that seam to the dark side. And when you do that, you'll have what I always thought looks sort of like a little flower right there in the center. And that's going to reduce some of the bulk at your seams as well. And then once you have that, you'll get your iron and just press down on it. And then you can use your clapper, or like I said, I use an old maple cutting board for that. And the nice thing about this spinning the seams is that if you were needing to sew this pinwheel to another pinwheel, when you spin the seams, I've got one here, you can see, since I spun the seams, these seams will actually still nest, whereas if I had pressed my seams open, then that cross-section seam won't nest with the other cross-section seams. Now, for my Ninjas in the Jungle pattern, you're not sewing these pinwheels to other pinwheels, so that's not really a huge factor. But it is, you know, just something to think about if you did have a pattern where you were using mostly pinwheels and having to sew pinwheels to other pinwheels. So you can see this one right here that's already done. Spun the seam, and when you flip that over, you can give it a press from the top if you want to, and then use your clapper on that as well. And that way your pinwheel will lay nice and flat. So you got a couple options here. We've got open seams versus spinning your seams. And that's kind of all down to preference as far as which one you like better. And it may also have to do with what you're doing with these pinwheels. If you're not sewing the pinwheels to other pinwheels, you probably don't care whether this cross-section seam will nest to the other cross-section seams or not. So that may not be a factor. In a lot of patterns, I actually direct to press the cross-section seam of pinwheels open, just because a lot of people are familiar with pressing open seams, but they may not be familiar with pressing, like with spinning the seams like this. Now, this spinning the seams technique, you can do that with 4 patches. Even though there's not going to be a lot of bulk at the seams of the 4 patch, you can do that with your 4 patches, and that'll make it to where you can nest that cross-section seam as well. You can do it with hourglasses so that you can nest the cross-section seam. So it's a nice little technique. I'm going to do one more for you just to show you. So if you chain pieced your pinwheels, we'll pick that apart first. And then when you press your seams, you're just looking, or when you spin your seams, you're just going to pull this seam apart. And if it pulls apart easy like mine did, you don't have to get your seam ripper out. But if you see it's struggling to pull apart, then you may want to use your seam ripper just so that you don't rip your fabric. So I'm going to use the seam ripper on this one just to pick a few of those stitches there at the top out so that I can pull that seam apart. So see, I've pulled that seam apart and I've pulled that seam apart. And then once those seams are pulled apart, you just pull them in opposite directions, and I like to pull it over so that we are going towards the dark side of that pinwheel. And you make that little flower there, press down over it, clap it if you want to, and then you can press from the top too, clap it if you want to, and then that's going to just reduce your bulk a lot in your seams.
So you can see me in this video using my old maple cutting board as a tailor's clapper, and you can see how I was able to get into a nice rhythm of set the seam, press, put the clapper over that one, leave it under there while you do the next same thing with the next one, set the seam, press, move the clapper over, and then kind of switching back and forth. So you can see how it was easy to get in a nice rhythm with that, and that should help you flatten out those seams and reduce some of the bulk.